It all started with the shaking of a cute island in the middle of the deep blue of the Aegean, and the whole agenda changed in an instant.
Santorini.
Yunanistan'ın Santorini adası
shook the island of Santorini.
Santorini yanardağının patlaması.
Santorini, one of the most beautiful islands in Greece.
Yalnız orası patlarsa hepimize alasmaldır.
Earthquakes, floods, fires. We were thinking that there was nothing left to happen to us. And now the Santorini volcano started to say, "I'm here from the deep blue." So should we be worried? After all, we are talking about a volcano that is almost 200 kilometers away from Turkey, from an island in Greece, even if it erupts. What can happen? This video will bother you a lot because Santorini has shown its terrifying power to humanity before, and those who saw this monster waking up from its sleep realized too late that they were looking at their own apocalypse. Welcome to Find the Truth. Santorini, an island community of white houses lined up on the blue horizon of the Aegean Sea, admired by tourists. Santorini, or Thera as it was known in ancient times, is today famous for its fairy tale views and romantic sunsets. But this tranquil and enchanting geography was home to one of the largest volcanic disasters in the history of the world about 3,600 years ago, turning today's romantic landscape into an apocalyptic landscape. Volcanic eruptions have a rhythm all their own. After hundreds, perhaps thousands of years of waiting, a terrifying birth takes place as the surging magma makes its way to the earth. The Santorini volcano was following such a rhythm. The Minoan civilization, which was dominant in the Mediterranean at that time, had written its name in history as a cultural focus centered on today's Crete, an epitome of civilization, and determined its position as the superpower of the Aegean. The Minoans were known for their impressive palaces, advanced architecture, pottery, and mastery of maritime trade. Santorini was closely associated with the Minoan world and even stood out as an important naval base and trading point. The island of Thera has long been home to signs of volcanic activity, even if its inhabitants didn't realize it. Small earthquakes, changes in the local hot springs, the smell of sulfur hanging in the air. It is a mystery when the islanders notice these signs, or even if they realize that these were the grumblings of a sleeping giant. But it seems that they did not pay attention to these warnings and did not try to flee the area, which may be because in the Aegean, which is already famous for its earthquakes, such tremors are seen as a part of life. But what would happen to the people of Minoan would be much bigger than a classic Aegean earthquake. 3,600 years ago, the crescent-shaped group of islands we know today as Santorini was actually the large island of Thera, which was in one piece and looked like this. It is very different from the crescent shape of today, isn't it? The reason for this is the monster that lies at the center of the island. We don't know exactly how big Thera was. Some experts talk about an area of 90 square kilometers, and at the heart of the island, a huge volcanic caldera with a diameter of 12 kilometers was hidden, and magma and gas had begun to compress in its 400-kilometer roots under the sea. That day, everything started normally for the people of the Aegean. The sounds of ships docking at the port of Therata, a trading stop for the Minoan and other civilizations, the sounds of people running in the streets, and the sounds of the waves that have been beating the island for thousands of years. But that day, unlike other days, the animals were silent, the birds were not singing, the dogs were not howling, because they heard the sound coming from the heart of the island and they were nervously listening to it, even though people could not hear it, and everything was going normally. And suddenly, life in the Aegean was over. The 12-kilometer caldera exploded so violently that 40 kilometers of the island was blown up with it. The 200 decibel intensity of the explosion was enough to burst the eardrums of people kilometers away and was heard as far away as Egypt on the other side of the Mediterranean. Earthquakes, but these giant earthquakes were nothing compared to what was about to happen next. When the island of millions of tons was shattered by the force of the explosion and buried in the sea by the collapse of the caldera, building-high tsunamis ranging in size from 30 to 35 meters began to move at a speed of 250 kilometers per hour towards the coasts of modern Greece and Turkey, destroying the entire Aegean coast before people even realized what was happening. Knossos, the glorious capital of the great Minoan civilization, the island of modern-day Crete, struggles with the tremors. And before the people even have a chance to escape, gigantic waves almost devour the island like a hungry beast. The people of Minoa, Umeio, the Pearl of the Aegean, the epitome of civilization of the Bronze Age, were buried in a watery grave. Moreover, the destruction had just begun. If there were survivors of the earthquakes and tsunamis, when they raised their heads in panic, they would witness that the sun that illuminated them, gave them hope and life, was gradually disappearing because the ash and dust spewing from the mouth of the giant volcano rose 40 kilometers in the atmosphere and gradually began to cut off the sun's rays and plunge thousands of kilometers into darkness. The direct and indirect effects of the catastrophe had severed trade networks, ended agriculture, and left the once vibrant coastline to its fate. We don't have much information about the detailed effects of this explosion because all the civilizations in the region that could take note of that information disappeared either with this event or in the troubled periods that followed. So the effects of the event began to turn into myths, legends, and events called divine. But the ancient Egyptian civilization, which somehow managed to survive even after this chain of disasters, recorded the following painful information in the Leiden papyrus. The rivers flow like blood, the sky is dark, and no one sees the sun. One of the most destructive effects of a volcanic eruption is the dust and ash that it emits. These ashes are so hot that they start fires where they fall and suffocate people. Moreover, there is no escape from them because they fall like snow. All nature and all living things in the areas they affect slowly suffocate and die by burning and being covered with ash. This is what is reflected in the Egyptian inscriptions that the rivers flow like blood and no one sees the sun. I have already mentioned that the unimaginable amount of ash from the volcanoes blocked the atmosphere over an area of thousands of kilometers. That's why we see that even in Egypt, nature was affected by this destruction. It must have been an apocalyptic sight for the people of that time. The connection with the places they had been trading with for decades was suddenly broken. There were terrible noises and tremors. The sky darkened for weeks, maybe months, and death literally rained down from the sky. Imagine the horror. This is how the islands of Santorini, which you may have visited today or seen on TV and where millions of people go every year to watch the unique sunset view, were formed, although everyone who looks at the view from those hills may or may not be aware that they are looking at a pit that has exploded and disappeared in time. Most people just watch the sun set into the blue of the Aegean in a fascinating way. But what they do not know is that the sun really set on those lands thousands of years ago, never to rise. One of the biggest and most popular theories of the historical repercussions of this catastrophe is the legend of Atlantis, as told by the philosopher Plato in his dialogues. Plato describes Atlantis as an enormous civilization, a majestic island state that rose in the middle of the seas and suddenly sank into the waters. Some argue that this lost continent described by Plato was actually the Minoan civilization that was affected by the great eruption of Thera. According to legend, Atlantis sank to the bottom of the sea forever because it had attracted the wrath of the gods. In much the same way, the Thera catastrophe symbolized the rapid destruction of a glorious civilization. Plato's writings are, of course, dialogues and philosophical stories, but scholars have been studying these similarities for many years. Considering the ceramics, luxurious houses, and sewage systems found in the excavations in the Minoan city of Akrotiri, there is no doubt that this suddenly vanished society lived in a golden age compared to other countries at the time. The sudden collapse that followed points to a fate similar to the myth of Atlantis. Perhaps the Atlantis described by Plato was the very end that the Minoans suffered, at least according to the normal approach, which is a perfectly reasonable claim if we don't make it a matter of extreme history. Some researchers suggest that Old Testament disaster stories in the Exodus narratives led by Moses may also be linked to the Thera eruption. There are various theories that miraculous scenes, such as the parting of the Red Sea, may have been mythologized natural phenomena triggered by volcanic activity. Of course, it is difficult to find clear evidence to confirm these theories, but descriptions such as rivers flowing like blood or the sky darkening do not sound so impossible when you consider how huge volcanic eruptions darken the atmosphere. There is another interesting historical turn after the Thera eruption, the wave of sea peoples, after the catastrophes and the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations. The wave of migration and influx that started from the Aegean in the 1300s BC, hitting the eastern Mediterranean and weakening even great empires such as the Hittites in Egypt, is called the migration of the sea peoples in history. Although the Thera eruption took place around 1600 BC, it is argued that the geopolitical and economic collapse it caused paved the way for large-scale migration and revolt movements in the following centuries. Changing trade routes, the destruction of the coasts, and the collapse of the Minoan Gyrite culture may have upset the balance in the Aegean and accelerated the movement of lost civilizations to new geographies. Who knows, maybe those Sea People's expeditions were the shadow of the Thera catastrophe stretching centuries into the future. There is no conclusive evidence, but when we examine the historical documents, it is not unreasonable to think that the explosion paved the way for the next great upheavals like dominoes. The mysterious Sea People event and the Bronze Age collapse video will be with you on my channel very soon. If there are those who say how much impact a volcano can have on the world, it is very important for you to understand the difference between a standard volcano and a supervolcano in order to understand the seriousness of the Santorini incident, especially as a person living in Turkey. In the world, volcanic eruption power values range from 0 to 8, and 7 to 8 are the supervolcano values. If we consider that the number at each level indicates an intensity 10 times greater than the value below it, you can imagine the difference in power between a standard volcanic eruption of 2-3 and an eruption of 8. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? Who knows what the effect of such an eruption would be? Even the imagination is scary. But the fact is that our world has experienced eruptions of this intensity before, and several of them erupted at the same time and the world was destroyed as a result. I didn't say that to be dramatic. It was really destroyed. Approximately 250 million years ago, the ancient world entered a period of catastrophe with the sudden eruption of supervolcanoes in the Siberian region. This event, known in history as the Permian extinction, resulted in the death of 70% of all land creatures living on our world, which was then a single continent, 90% of all living creatures in the seas, which became toxic due to the ash, and 95% of all life on the planet with the collapse of the ecosystem. The Permian period was a period when the diversity of life on Earth exploded, and in 60,000 years, all these creatures gradually disappeared, and not only that, but similar eruptions continued for another 1 million years as the great continent of Pangaea broke into pieces. If you consider that the entire history of humanity as we know it is 450,000 years, you can better understand the length of the destruction. After all these disasters, it took 10 million years for life on Earth to recover. This is why supervolcanoes are the most dangerous natural phenomena you will ever see on the planet, and we do not even have the slightest technology to mitigate their effects. So with the current earthquakes in the Aegean and the news about Santorini volcano in the news, should we start to be seriously worried? It is very difficult to give a yes or no answer to that. It is actually Colombo volcano, which is located nearby rather than Santorini. That is the volcano that poses the main risk at the moment. But if it makes you feel a little bit better, it is not a supervolcano. It is an underwater volcano that is considered to be of normal strength. But that does not mean that there is no danger, because Colombo volcano has erupted before. The volcano erupted in 1650 and 70 people lost their lives due to the tsunami and earthquakes caused by the volcano. Especially now that coastal settlement on both sides of the Aegean has increased dramatically in the intervening almost 400 years, it is now feared that if the mountain erupts again, the destruction will be much greater. Even more important is the risk of severe earthquakes that the mountain could trigger during the eruption. In such a case, the Aegean faults, which have already increased stress after the February 6th earthquake, could experience a much larger rupture and, God forbid, trigger earthquakes that would affect both our country and our neighbor extremely badly. But geology is an interesting subject, and after all these tremors, life can return to normal again without anything happening. For example, in 2011, the Aegean was shaken for 14 months like today, but it did not trigger any volcanic event. But the more important question, and the one that is getting media attention, is can the Santorini supervolcano really erupt? Scientifically speaking, yes, it can erupt, but whether this eruption can be like the one I told you at the beginning of the video 3,600 years ago, it seems to be a bit difficult, because when a supervolcano erupts, it can naturally break down its own magma outlets and roots, so it is theoretically difficult for it to accumulate power as before. So yes, the Santorini volcano could erupt, but it is very unlikely that it will be in the category of a supervolcano. But even if it is in the category of a normal volcano, It is a dangerous situation because the region we are talking about is a region with a very dense human population, sea trade, and agriculture. And it is a region that will be seriously affected by destructive effects such as earthquakes, tsunamis, and ash ejections. So I hope that these earthquakes will end as soon as possible and the region will calm down. Otherwise, even the most innocent scenario can have extremely dangerous and destructive consequences. As I mentioned earlier, the world is an active planet, and in these natural rhythms, sometimes strong winds, sometimes movements in fault lines, and sometimes such tides can be experienced with the effect of the moon and the sun. We should not immediately attribute the event to the fact that the sea has receded and a tsunami is happening, because the Aegean ground is being actively monitored and warnings will be made quickly in a bad scenario. But it is a fact that the magma deposits in Santorini and Colombo in the Aegean have started to swell. And I repeat that this does not necessarily mean that the volcano will erupt. It also swelled in 2011, but then it calmed down. I hope that the ground will calm down again in the same way and unwanted events will not occur. But it is a fact that history has repeatedly shown us that volcanoes that we see as sleeping giants can suddenly activate one day and turn the world upside down. From the Minoans to the myth of Atlantis, from the stories of catastrophe and sacred texts to the mysterious migrations of the sea peoples, Santorini volcano is always hovering like a shadow. 3,600 years ago, the eruption of the great island of Thera was not only a local catastrophe, but also a major crisis for civilizations in and around the Mediterranean basin. We may be enjoying azure waters, elegant white houses, and perfect landscapes without noticing the breathing of the volcano that lies beneath us. But the Earth has maintained the same rhythm for millions of years: sleep, swell, eruption, destruction, and rebirth. The prophecies about Santorini are nothing more than this natural cycle. One day, the beast hiding in the deep blue may wake up again or may continue to sleep for thousands of years. As I said, geology is actually slow but extremely dynamic because our world is constantly moving. So there is no need to take the sails down immediately, but our geography is at the heart of such dangers, and at least for Turkey and Greece, these events will always be a great danger. I hope that the authorities will take these warnings seriously. I hope that they will monitor the region closely using technology. I hope that buildings will be built more earthquake resistant in more protected places. And I hope that if one day we have to face this monster, we will not be too late like the Minoan people did in the past. Take care and see you in the next video.